Although J.R.R. Tolkien is often seen as the founder of fantasy, he wasn't the first person to write stories set in an invented magical world. In my last video, I gave an overview of fantasy novels written before the publication of The Lord of the Rings in 1954. But if you haven't seen that, then don't worry. This video will be mostly self-contained, because we're talking about a separate tradition that emerged concurrently with those books. Magazines are something that you probably don't think about much these days, but they used to be a big deal. Back in the day, people wanted something to read, but they only had so much money to shell out on hardcover books. So it was more convenient to subscribe to magazines, which every month or so would send out issues that included a mixture of news articles, poetry, short stories, and entire novels serialized over the course of multiple issues. Many of the most iconic books of this era were originally published serially in magazines. And by the start of the 20th century, as the medium expanded, a delineation had formed between the so-called glossy magazines, where respectable literary fiction was published, and the mass-market pulp magazines, which prioritized entertainment value first and foremost, and which served as a catalyst for all sorts of genre fiction. Now, pulp magazines existed in many countries, but for whatever reason, just as nearly all examples of literary fantasy from the last video came from the United Kingdom, the pulp fantasy that we'll be talking about today is a product of the United States. And whereas the tradition of literary fantasy felt rather disjointed, each author was pursuing their own idiosyncratic vision without much interconnection with the rest. The nature of the pulps means that it's here that we can actually see fantasy emerge as a coherent genre, with different authors taking and developing each other's ideas, while also putting their own spin on them, to the point that, as we'll see, many of the tropes and styles and subgenres of fantasy as we know it today were already out there in some form before The Lord of the Rings ever came into print. And in the conclusion, I'll give a brief sketch of how this all led into the modern genre. But before we begin, obligatory warning that there will be plenty of spoilers in this video. I also probably ought to give a content warning that with early 20th century pulp fantasy, there will be staggering levels of racism. There will also be mentions of suicide and discussions of fictional depictions of sexual violence. The pulp magazines were where all sorts of lurid and sensational stories got published, and within this, fantasy was a very small niche. The market was mostly taken up by adventure stories, westerns, and detective fiction, stuff that, well, maybe wasn't very realistic, but firmly took place in our own world. The first pulp author to really break through with stories that went beyond this was Edgar Rice Burroughs. By his own account, he was a failed, middle-aged businessman who saw the types of stories that were put out in these magazines and decided that he could do one better, that he could cash in by writing the most over-the-top, ridiculous story he could think of. The end result was a novel serialized in 1912 in the All Story magazine using the pen name Norman Bean, titled Under the Moons of Mars. It would later be reprinted under his own name as A Princess of Mars. The story follows a frontiersman named John Carter, who by mystical means is transported from the deserts of Arizona to the planet Mars, or rather Barsoom as it's called by the natives. Now this story mostly conforms to what we'd label as science fiction, but it also contains elements that we'd associate with fantasy. The planet is ruled by feudal kingdoms, And though there is some advanced technology, they have a strict sense of honor, which means they do most of their combat with swords rather than guns. The people of Barsoom are also divided into distinct races who are, conveniently for Carter, who's a veteran of the Confederate Army, differentiated by their skin color. They range from the barbaric, four-armed green Martians to the civilized red Martians who have convergently evolved to look just like sexy humans, to the white, black, and yellow Martians that get introduced in later books. About half the story is dedicated to info dumping about these people and their customs and cultures. It is an impressive amount of world building, though you get the distinct impression that Burroughs is just making it up as he goes along. Meanwhile, the other half of the story is a straightforward power fantasy, as the weak gravity of Mars provides Carter with superhuman strength, which lets him conquer any obstacle with ease. After navigating through many dangers, he wins the respect of the Green Martian tribes, and then uses their aid to rescue the Red Martian princess Dejah Thoris and take her as his bride. It's an over-the-top, action-packed story taking place in a bizarre alien world, and it absolutely blew the socks off of contemporary readers. Burroughs wasn't the first person to write about interplanetary adventure, but there was something engaging and exciting about his writing that made it take off like nothing before. It even sparked an entire copycat genre of planetary romance stories, which took the same formula of action-adventure taking place on an exotic alien planet, with scientific accuracy being so little of a concern that they often drifted into outright magic. Long before the idea of a Tolkien imitator was ever a thing, the Edgar Rice Burroughs imitators were in full swing. And no one cashed in on this more than Edgar Rice Burroughs himself. He ended up writing 10 books in the Barsoom series, and started other franchises like Pellucidar about the Earth's interior where time is subjective and humanity wages war against a race of all-female pterosaurs who have perfected themselves by means of eugenics, and Amptor, the planet Venus, which is ruled by a communist dictatorship who our Earthling hero combats by forming a violent insurgent group which uses the initials KKK. But by far, Burroughs' most successful and longest-running series was the story of Tarzan, the child of English aristocracy who's raised by apes in the jungles of Africa, and due to his innate genetic superiority becomes king of the jungle, ruling over the native black Africans in a bloody reign of terror, before he goes on to have many more adventures across the savage continent. Yeah, a lot of these Pulp Fiction stories have not aged very well. But moving on from that, another best-selling pulp author who deserves a mention is Abraham Merritt. He was a journalist by profession, but he wrote fiction in his spare time. Most of his work fell into the Lost World tradition, featuring scientists who wander into ancient subterranean realms and encounter monsters and hidden advanced civilizations that stretch the bounds of what can be explained by modern science. These were marketed as rousing adventure stories, but there was also an element of horror to them. Merritt had a particular reputation for his slow-paced, atmospheric writing style, which really sells the feeling that you're becoming lost in this strange, dark, subterranean world. But in terms of his contributions to fantasy, he's best known for The Ship of Ishtar, which was serialized in the Argosy All-Story magazine in 1924. Here, an archaeologist tampers with an ancient Babylonian artifact that transports him to a pocket dimension, where a priestess of Ishtar and a priest of Nergal have spent millennia deadlocked in warfare. This is perhaps the first true example in the pulps of fantasy which is fully magical, as opposed to pseudoscientific like Burroughs' works, and which takes place in a separate world, as opposed to taking place on our own modern-day Earth like Merritt's other stories. Although we see very little of this new dimension outside of the eponymous ship, where our hero predictably defeats the priest of Nurgle and takes the priestess of Ishtar as his lover. We still haven't come close to exploring the full potential of fantasy storytelling. For that, we need to look past the popular bestsellers like Burroughs and Merritt, and instead we need to turn our attention to authors that were more obscure in their own time. In particular, we need to turn our attention to one specific magazine. Weird Tales released its first issue in March 1923, and the magazine would go on running until September 1954. In that time, it released a total of 279 issues, and lucky for us, all of them have been scanned and are available for free online on the Internet Archive. Shout out to all of the people who have worked to make these available, especially to Reddit user LegoFan94, who created a spreadsheet to easily go through each issue in publication order. I'll include a link to that in the description. Weird Tales specialized in fairly straightforward horror, stories about ghosts, vampires, and werewolves. But it was also a magazine for anything that was, well, weird. In its pages, you could find science fiction, exotic adventure stories, and planetary romance. So much planetary romance, in fact, that readers wrote letters to the editor complaining that the genre had become bland and oversaturated. But today, Weird Tales is best known for three specific writers, who were some of its most prolific contributors: H.P. Lovecraft, Clark Ashton Smith, and Robert E. Howard, who are widely considered to be three of the greatest fantasy authors of all time. Howard Phillips Lovecraft debuted in Weird Tales in October 1923 with the short story Dagon. Though technically his writing did appear in the previous September issue, where the editor took the unusual step of publishing Lovecraft's submission letter. Here, his insecurities are evident, as he alternates between extreme self-deprecation and a rather dismissive attitude towards other stories in the magazine. Although the editors ultimately liked his stories enough to publish them, it seems that they also felt the need to show off this letter to the readers in order to get a load of this guy. Lovecraft is someone who was always ill-adjusted. Growing up in Providence, Rhode Island, he was drawn to a fatalistic philosophy from a young age. He saw life as meaningless and humanity as an insignificant speck in an uncaring universe, and so he escaped into fiction and found a special allure in the fantastic and macabre. His first published work of fiction appeared in 1912 in the Rhode Island Evening Journal. It was called Providence in 2000 AD and took place in a dystopian future where the character of Providence, Rhode Island has changed due to increased immigration. Fox Point is now called San Miguel's Cape. South Main is now O'Murphy's Avenue. Westminster Street is now Svensson's Lane. Yeah, if you know anything about Lovecraft, you'll know that he was filled with fear and disgust at the thought of interacting with those he deemed his racial inferiors. This was one of the many neuroses that made it difficult for him to earn a stable living. Throughout his life, he made most of his money through sporadic work as an editor and ghostwriter, and he only wrote his own fiction in sporadic bursts. He was a perfectionist who believed that he should reach for higher standards than the hack writers that dominated the pulp magazines. And as a result of this, his output was highly irregular. His early work took heavy inspiration from his favorite author, Edgar Allan Poe, telling stories of ghosts, murder, and melancholy. But in 1919, he discovered Lord Dunsany, who we discussed back in part 1. Lovecraft was someone who had always preferred fantasy to reality, and he was utterly entranced. He began writing his own fiction in a similar vein, highly atmospheric, fairy tale-like stories taking place in surreal, magical settings. This formed his so-called dream cycle, which included stories like The Doom That Came to Sarnaut, The Cats of Ultar, and the posthumously published novella The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadat, which stands out if only for the way it juxtaposes a very characteristically Lovecraftian vision of a dark, surreal dreamscape with some rather silly elements like an army of talking cats or flying night gas, which incapacitate their prey by tickling them. But Lovecraft couldn't shake the feeling that these were just pale imitations of Dunsany. They used a similar style and similar themes, but were just not quite as effective. In particular, Dunsany was known for his flowing, ornate prose, but Lovecraft's writing has a much more stilted quality that works well when he's telling horror stories from the first-person perspective of a stuffy New England gentleman, but isn't nearly as effective when trying to tell Dunsanian fantasy. And so, around the time he began contributing to Weird Tales in the early to mid-1920s, Lovecraft made an effort to move on from mere pastiches of Poe or Dunsany and develop his own distinctive style. Horror that's set on Earth with a focus on characters who delve into occult matters and uncover far, far more than they bargained for, featuring powerful forces beyond human comprehension, and cults in service to enigmatic deities like Cthulhu, Dagon, Hasta, and Yog-Sothoth. This is a pantheon that's, on some level, inspired by Dunsany's Gods of Pagana, but rather than being your typical anthropomorphized gods, they are depicted as interdimensional alien beings whose ultimate goals and motivations are unknowable to mere mortals. Lovecraft's brand of cosmic horror is highly distinctive, but it didn't come completely from scratch. He was very open about the authors he admired and took inspiration from. A. Merritt was one of his favorite pulp authors, and if you saw part 1, it shouldn't surprise you to see William Hope Hodgson on this list. Lovecraft had strong praise for Hodgson's The Nightland, though he also qualified this by saying that it is seriously marred by a painful verboseness, rapaciousness, artificial, and nauseously sticky romantic sentimentality, and an attempt at archaic language that is grotesque and absurd. And for Lovecraft, of all people to say that, you know the situation is quite dire. And of course, Lovecraft's own personal interests, fears, and insecurities manifested themselves in his stories in myriad ways. And I think you know exactly where this is heading. For a lot of people watching, Lovecraft is the only author in this video who you were aware of beforehand, and one of the top 3 things you know about him is that he was extraordinarily racist and xenophobic. And this came up in his stories in ways that were both subtle and very explicit. As for situating him in the context of his time, the contents of the stories themselves do not particularly stand out. In pulp magazines like Weird Tales, offensive racial stereotypes were the norm, often in rather extreme and bizarre forms, to the point that Lovecraft stories come off as rather mild by comparison. But most of these other writers were essentially casual racists, and when they corresponded with Lovecraft, they were often taken aback by the sheer intensity and obsessiveness of his prejudices, which, even by the standards of the time, were weird and off-putting. Though his life would take several unexpected turns. Sonia Green, a fellow writer who happened to be a Jewish woman born in Ukraine, saw something there and initiated a romantic relationship with Lovecraft, leading to their marriage in 1924. She fervently believed that she could fix him, and in turn, he accepted her as one of the good ones. Unsurprisingly, it did not work out, and the two of them were separated within a few years. And then, during the Great Depression, Lovecraft lost faith in conservative politics and began identifying as a socialist. It's often said that in this time he mellowed out considerably in his racial prejudices, but mellow here is being used in a relative sense. And considering that near the end of his life he was still writing letters in defense of lynching, I think it's quite a stretch to say that he was completely reformed. But independent of Lovecraft as a person, it is difficult to deny that there is a certain quality to his work. Something that taps deep into the human psyche, to the point that decades after his death, he is far more famous today than he ever was while he was still alive. And modern fantasy is full of homages to his mythos. Strange, interdimensional beings who enact their will upon the world via mysterious cults, and whose physical appearance is mainly described in terms of their large number of tentacles. Yet, as a writer of his own secondary world fantasy, there isn't terribly much to say about Lovecraft, if only because his dream cycle is quite a small body of work. To get back to the subject of this video, we should move on to the next member of the Weird Tales Triumvirate. Clark Ashton Smith began submitting poetry to Weird Tales in 1927. This was the medium where he felt most comfortable. He had been considered a prodigy as a teenager, acclaimed by literary circles across the nation. But it's quite difficult to make poetry pay the bills, so once he grew up, he eked out a meager living as a manual laborer in his hometown of Auburn, California, while also still doing his best to promote his poems alongside his forays into the visual arts. And in both of these, he gained a reputation for his focus on dark and fantastical themes. And in 1922, he received fan mail from one H.P. Lovecraft, who admitted to him, "I have tried to write short stories and sketches affording glimpses into the unknown abysses of terror which leer beyond the boundaries of the known, but have never succeeded in evoking even a fraction of the stark hideousness conveyed by any one of your ghoulishly potent designs." This was the beginning of a long correspondence. Lovecraft recommended Smith the stories of Lord Dunsany, along with other books he enjoyed, such as The Worm Ouroboros by E.R. Edison, but he was less impressed by Smith's own recommendation of James Branch Cabell, whom Lovecraft believed to be suffering from an excess of detached irony. And eventually, Lovecraft convinced Smith to begin submitting his work to Weird Tales. At first, it was only short poems, but by the end of the 20s, Smith was writing his own short stories in a Dunsanian style similar to Lovecraft's dream cycle, taking place in pseudo-Oriental lands in Earth's mythic past. But Smith's stories differ from Lovecraft's in some key respects. He was a poet, first and foremost, and you can tell. Lovecraft is sometimes accused of purple prose, but Smith is at an entirely different level. His writing is very drawn out and is filled with obscure and ornate language. It's something that some people really love and others find to be really difficult to get through. But as for the content of these stories, Smith was heavily drawn to horror. But whereas Lovecraft had a cold and impersonal feel, featuring alien cosmic horrors far removed from human emotion, Smith's brand of horror was far more visceral. These were stories about very human feelings of pride, greed, and lust. These were stories that evoked the fear of violent death, and the sense of disgust at blood, gore, and rotting flesh. The Testament of Othamus, for instance, is told from the perspective of an executioner who is tasked with putting down a criminal that, each time he is beheaded, mysteriously returns from the dead and goes on a cannibalistic rampage through the city. Other stories take on a more ribald tone, like Mother of Toes, which ends with the protagonist being smothered to death in the ample bosom of a monstrous frog woman. And as for his stage play, The Dead Will Cuckold You, well, I'll leave that one to your imagination. And on that note, I might mention that while Lovecraft and Smith both had a similarly withdrawn personality, Smith's amorous ambitions seemed to be much greater, and he apparently became quite popular among the married women of Auburn. And of course, while Lovecraft only wrote a relatively small number of stories in his dream cycle, Smith's body of fantasy was far more extensive, with whole collections of stories set in mythic ancient settings like the northern kingdom of Hyperborea, or Poseidonus, the last floundering isle of lost Atlantis. And here, I should probably bring up someone who I've neglected to mention up to this point, but who cast a long shadow over early pulp fantasy. Helena Blavatsky was a Russo-American occultist who developed the new religious movement of Theosophy. This was based, so she claimed, on mythic revelations from the Ascended Masters of Tibet. In her book, The Secret Doctrine, she recounts the true history of Earth via the rise and fall of various root races on lost continents like Atlantis and Lemuria, all leading up to our modern, spiritually degraded era. Blavatsky's teachings had a surprising amount of cultural cachet around the turn of the century, and they would later be recycled in large part into the New Age movement of the 1960s. And in the meantime, it also provided ample fodder for sci-fi and fantasy writers. Critics have noted the similarities in the bizarre world-building of Edgar Rice Burroughs and some of Blavatsky's writings, though the actual connection between the two is rather tenuous. But it's far more widely accepted that A. Merritt's Lost World stories were in large part inspired by theosophical ideas. H.P. Lovecraft was a scientific materialist, but he often read occultist literature for storytelling inspiration, and includes a few mentions of theosophy in his writing. Meanwhile, Clark Ashton Smith was a spiritual freethinker with a fondness for Eastern ideas. And though he found theosophy a bit too out there to take it seriously, he evidently found something compelling about its mythology, and he openly admitted to liberally borrowing its ideas. The land of Hyperborea is originally from Greek mythology, but it's also mentioned in The Secret Doctrine as the homeland of the second root race. Meanwhile, Poseidonus, as the last remnant of sunken Atlantis, is fully an invention of theosophy, which Smith took as his own. And then there's his most famous setting, which he derived from the theosophical continent of Pushkara, which did not exist in the ancient past, but is instead prophesied to arise in the future once humanity has achieved enlightenment. But of course, Smith puts his own, darker spin on the concept. On Zothique, the last continent on Earth, the sun no longer shone with the whiteness of its prime, but was dim and tarnished as with a vapor of blood. New stars without number had declared themselves in the heavens, and the shadows of the infinite had fallen closer. And out of the shadows the older gods had returned to man, the gods forgotten since Hyperborea, since Mu and Poseidonus, bearing other names but the same attributes. And the elder demons had also returned, battening on the fumes of evil sacrifice, and fostering again the primordial sorceries. The Zothique cycle tells of Earth's far future, where modern technology has been long forgotten and magic has taken its place. And it is a bleak, gloomy place of gruesome violence and decadent excess. It's partially an inversion of the theosophical paradise of Pushkara, and there's also definitely parallels with William Hope Hodgson's The Nightland. But I think by far the most visible influence comes from one of Smith's favorite books, Vathek by William Beckford. This is a darkly humorous Oriental fantasy about an Arabian caliph who dabbles in black magic until his cruelty and hubris lead to his downfall and eternal damnation, a pattern which repeats itself quite often in the Zothique stories. The setting is introduced in the short story The Empire of the Necromancers. Here, the two sorcerers, Sodosma and Motmur, lusting for power, travel to the ruined empire of Sincor and reanimate the corpses of its inhabitants to use as slaves. And as a side note, this is the earliest story where I've ever seen the word necromancy used to describe the act of magically raising dead bodies as zombified servants. In traditional magic practices, the word refers to summoning the incorporeal spirits of the dead. But having invented this conception of necromancy, Smith immediately takes it to its logical conclusion. Those who were fairest, whom the plague and the worm had not ravaged overmuch, they took for their lemons and made to serve their necrophilic lust. In Sincor, Motmur and Sodosma live a life of unimaginable decadence as they draft plans to conquer neighboring kingdoms with their undead army. But unbeknownst to them, the reanimated corpses still retain a remnant of consciousness, and two of them, Aliro and Hestion, remember that in a hidden room in the palace, there is a deep abyss leading directly to the fires of the earth, which is the only thing that can grant them reprieve from this undeath. They maintain enough agency to kill the necromancers in their sleep, and chop up the corpses before casting their own reanimation spell back onto them. They then lead the rest of the undead into the abyss, but make sure to lock the doors behind them. And thence, by the coiling stairs, they wended their way to the verge of the sunken flames, and were one with their kinfolk and their people in the last ultimate nothingness. But of Motmur and Sodosma, men say that their quartered bodies crawl to and fro to this day in Yethrodom, finding no peace or respite from their doom of life and death, and seeking vainly through the black maze of the nether vaults the door that was locked by Aliro. I think it's safe to call Smith's Zothique the ancestor of a lot of what we now call dark fantasy, featuring gloomy, dreary lands filled with ruined kingdoms, power-hungry sorcerers, malevolent gods, and stories that end unhappily. It's a tradition that's often seen as antithetical to Tolkien-esque fantasy. But in fact, Clark Ashton Smith did read The Lord of the Rings towards the end of his life and quite enjoyed it. Both he and Tolkien had a similar conception of evil in their stories as a potent force embodied in powerful supernatural beings, but which also, through its own foibles, inevitably brings its own destruction. And it also seems that he greatly admired the depth of Tolkien's world building. Smith's own approach to fantasy was more similar to Dunsany or to Lovecraft's Dream Cycle, that sense of soft world building that's more focused on creating a dark, mysterious atmosphere than in fleshing out the world in exquisite detail. But when you write so many stories in the same setting, there will inevitably be certain pieces of lore and interconnection that build up. The same characters and locations often appear or are mentioned across multiple stories, very often with the implication that a great amount of history has passed between the stories. A vibrant kingdom in one story might easily appear as a desolate ruin in another. And though his world building might not have been nearly as detailed as Tolkien's, Smith did put a surprising bit of thought into the language and ethnography of Zothique. He even created some linguistic fragments with the assumption that its people are the distant descendants of the modern-day inhabitants of Europe and the Middle East, merged into a single people. At a glance, this acceptance of cross-cultural integration seems progressive, especially when compared to the likes of Lovecraft, but upon closer inspection, there are some messier elements at play. One fact that adds some important context to the Orientalist art of this era is that, according to the racial pseudoscience of the time, Arabs and Iranians were, while not quite equal to Western Europeans, considered part of the so-called Caucasian racial group, and therefore were technically counted as white, in sharp contrast to the people of East Asia or Sub-Saharan Africa, whom Smith pointedly does not include in the melting pot of Zothique, and instead shunts them off into remote islands, where they're always described in very unflattering terms. When I tried to get a sense of Clark Ashton Smith's own politics, I could only find 2 articles that went over the subject in any detail, and it turns out that both of them were written by neo-Nazis who had very glowing things to say about him. This was not a great start, but overall, it seems that he was not nearly as vocal about his beliefs as Lovecraft, but he definitely shared many of the same views and prejudices. But again, it's hard for me to say much confidently about the man, simply because there aren't many high-quality sources available. Clark Ashton Smith is the Lepidus of the Weird Tales triumvirate. People don't talk about him nearly as much as the other two. As a horror writer, none of his creations are quite as iconic as those of H.P. Lovecraft. And as a writer of secondary world fantasy set in a mythic, quasi-theosophic era of Earth's history, he is overshadowed by the triumvirate's final member. Robert Irvin Howard first made it into Weird Tales in July 1925 when he was 19 years old with the caveman story Spear and Fang. He'd follow this up with stories about reoccurring characters like Solomon Kane, a Puritan witch hunter whose travels, for some reason, kept bringing him to darkest Africa. Or, more relevant for our purposes, Cole the Conqueror, a warrior of ancient Atlantis who has usurped the throne of the Proto-European Kingdom of Velusia. In Cole's introductory story, The Shadow Kingdom, he broods over the struggles of being king. He no longer lives a simple life where he can solve all his problems by swinging a sword at them. Now his life is dominated by political maneuvering and scheming aristocrats. That is, until he discovers that those scheming aristocrats actually all belong to an ancient race of shape-shifting reptilians who ruled the entire world from the shadows. And luckily for Cole, he's able to solve the problem by swinging his sword at them. Howard's writing was far more fast-paced and action-oriented than Lovecraft's or Smith's. He regarded himself as something of a man's man. He lived in the plains of West Texas and amused himself with boxing and gunslinging. But the very fact that I'm talking about him in this video means that he was also a massive nerd. In 1930, he sent a letter to H.P. Lovecraft taking issue with an inaccurate use of Celtic linguistics in one of his stories. Howard's ancestors were Irish, and so he had become quite obsessed with the topic. The two of them soon became frequent correspondents. Lovecraft even developed pet names for all of his writer friends. He spelt his own initials out phonetically as Ekpiel. Clark Ashton Smith became Clark Ashton, and he most often referred to Robert E. Howard as Two Gun Bob. But despite their friendship, they were not fully aligned. Whereas Lovecraft's worldview was fundamentally elitist and rationalist, Howard was a romantic who wished that he had been born in the days of the Wild West, or even better, as an ancient Germanic or Celtic tribesman. He saw civilization as something inherently unjust and hypocritical, a betrayal of humanity's noble, simple nature. He raged against the corrupt influence of big business, the brutality of the police, and imperialist wars of aggression, all of which he saw as symptoms of the rot inside of modern civilization. In the story By This Axe I Rule, there's another attempt to depose King Cole, but he crushes it with the help of two lovers, a noble and a slave girl, who are unable to marry each other under Volusia's strict code of law. Cole decides that apparently this is the greatest injustice faced by the slaves of his kingdom, and so he takes an axe and smashes the tablet where this law is laid out. And to the assembled aristocracy, he makes this proclamation. By this axe I rule! This is my scepter! I have struggled and sweated to be the puppet king you wished me to be, to king it your way! Now I use my own way! If you will not fight, you shall obey! Laws that are just shall stand. Laws that have outlived their times, I shall shatter as I shattered that one. I am king! This was Howard's philosophy in its rawest form, a bit too raw for publishers' tastes. After it was rejected by multiple magazines, he decided to rework the premise. Many plot details would change, and while he was at it, he decided that maybe it was time to retire the character of Cole. He still liked the idea of a primitive warrior hero who has usurped the throne of an advanced kingdom, and he still wanted to set the story in the mythic past, if only because that meant he wouldn't have to worry about being accurate to real recorded history. And so, rather than the Thurian Age during the height of ancient Atlantis, it would now take place in a Hyborian Age, after the sinking of that continent, but before the start of recorded history. The usurper king would now be a Cimmerian, and the name of his kingdom would be Acrilonia. And so, most people watching this will have had no awareness of Robert E. Howard or Cole the Conqueror, but I guarantee that you have heard the name Conan the Barbarian. By This Axe I Rule was reworked into The Phoenix on the Sword, published in Weird Tales in December 1932. And from then on, Conan the Barbarian became Howard's obsession. He began writing at a feverish pace, and at times seemed to speculate that he was the recipient of supernatural inspiration. Some of these stories follow up on Conan's tribulations as King of Acrilonia, but most of them take place during his earlier career as a thief, outlaw, and mercenary. A lot of the content of these stories feels not too different from the writings of H.P. Lovecraft or Clark Ashton Smith, featuring decadent kingdoms, evil sorcerers, grotesque monsters, and allusions to deeper, darker evils beyond mortal comprehension. But Lovecraft and Smith were both writing horror, and the structure of their stories was typically a slow, steady descent to an unavoidable, tragic ending. But with Howard, you can always expect Conan to save the day by swinging his sword, axe, or whatever other weapon he has on hand right at the monster's face, usually saying a pithy one-liner while he's at it. And this formula struck a real chord with the readers of Weird Tales. Now, adventure stories in the pulps were by no means a new phenomenon, but it was generally agreed that there is something different about the Conan stories. One factor is Howard's writing, which has a certain evocative quality. In particular, he has a characteristic way of writing fight scenes that's less focused on mechanically describing each swing of the sword, and more on the feeling of fluid motion. And then, there's the character of Conan himself, the paragon of barbaric masculinity, as opposed to the type of bland, sympathetic everyman used by other pulp writers like Edgar Rice Burroughs. Conan is a hard, grizzled warrior. He is gruff and unapproachable, sarcastic and rather crude, with motivations that mostly come down to women, wine, and riches. We're led to believe that he's done some rather unsavory things in his past life as a mercenary and outlaw. But he also has a strong sense of honor, which inevitably leads him to defeat the bad guy and save the imperiled maiden. When he usurps the throne of Aquilonia, he is a benevolent king who protects the common people from the exploitative aristocracy. The need for Conan to be this rough, amoral anti-hero, while simultaneously being not that bad a guy at the end of the day, sometimes leads to a very weird framing of events. The girl was Bretunian, whom Conan had found in the slave market of a stormed Shemite city and appropriated. She had nothing to say in the matter, but her new position was so far superior to the lot of any Hyborian woman in a Shemitish seraglio that she accepted it thankfully. Yeah, we'll loop back around to that. But so far, we've barely even touched on the world of Conan. In his essay, The Hyborian Age, Howard expands upon, well, the Hyborian Age, an invented time period after the cataclysm that caused the sinking of Atlantis, but before another cataclysm which created the world as we know it today. Europe and the Middle East are merged into a single, blobular, western-facing continent, which consistently seems to be the only type of map that fantasy authors are capable of creating. We're told that after the fall of Atlantis, the world descended into chaos. There was millennia of war, migration, enslavement, and rebellion. But eventually, stable kingdoms form. To the north are Aquilonia and Nemedia, which strongly foreshadow medieval Europe, complete with knights and castles. To the southeast, there are the exotic oriental lands of Shem and Stygia. And surrounding them all are various barbarian peoples, of whom none are mightier than Conan's own people, the Cimmerians of the north. They are descendants of ancient Atlanteans who degenerated into ape men after their civilization fell, only to re-evolve back into humans. They're just that tough. And when he gives us a brief sketch of how the Hyborian Age led to our own modern world, Howard makes sure to say that the descendants of the Cimmerians would later become the Gaels of Ireland, who are, of course, his own people. The Cimmerians' chief deity Crom would evolve into the pagan Irish god Crom Cruach, while Conan would remain a common name on the island into the present day. One feature in the essay that feels a bit quaint is that Howard felt the need to include a disclaimer. Nothing in this article is to be considered an attempt to advance any theory in opposition to accepted history. It is simply a fictional background for a series of fiction stories. But at the time, this was actually a very necessary thing to clarify, as up to this point, the main people writing mythic histories like this were theosophists, who very much did intend for their work to be taken as theories in opposition to accepted history. In fact, the only other person putting this level of effort into world building for a fictional fantasy setting in this time would have been J.R.R. Tolkien. Now, Howard's single essay on the Hyborian Age doesn't really match the breadth and depth of something like Tolkien's The Silmarillion, but of all the writers covered in this video, he may well be the one who comes closest to being a true rival of Tolkien, especially in the way he develops an imitable template for future fantasy writers. The Conan stories are the progenitor of what would come to be known as the sword and sorcery subgenre of fantasy about the episodic exploits of an adventurer hero, which is often contrasted with the more Tolkien-esque style of epic fantasy. In fact, it's very likely that in a world where The Lord of the Rings was never published, it would have been Robert E. Howard who was remembered as the father of fantasy. His work really deserves more attention, if only due to the sheer breadth of his influence, which has largely been forgotten in the last few decades. But my analysis would be incomplete if I didn't also mention that if you do give his stories a read, you will quickly encounter the elephant in the room. And by that, I don't just mean the god in the Tower of the Elephant, who turns out to actually be an extraterrestrial from the planet Yag. In Tolkien-esque fantasy, there's often controversy over the common trope of fantasy races who have abilities and personality traits assigned to them as immutable traits determined by heredity. Well, the Conan stories do the exact same thing, but with real-world human ethnicities. The Cimmerians, ancestors of the Irish, are always honest, fierce, and straightforward. Meanwhile, the Shemites, who are the common ancestor of Arabs and Jews, are known for being bloodthirsty and duplicitous. Then there's the Picts, who in real life were a Celtic people, but within the stories serve as a stand-in for Native Americans, varyingly depicted either as wise and noble savages, or as an unthinking horde who can be mowed down without remorse. But what sticks out more than anything is Howard's depiction of black characters. Now, whenever this subject comes up, there's always people who rush to his defense and say that his racial views were actually quite progressive by the standards of a white Texan in the 1930s. This may be true, but it's also an extraordinarily low bar. The fact is, black characters show up in Howard's writing quite often, and they are never portrayed as fully human, rather as grotesque monsters. Sometimes their existence is to be tolerated when they're in their place in servile roles. Otherwise, they're shown as bloodthirsty animals who Conan has to put down for the protection of white maidenhood. And I suppose we should say a few words about the White Maidens themselves. Like any good pulp hero, Conan rescues his share of damsels in distress. But whereas most adventure heroes in this era had a strong sense of chivalry, Conan, the barbarian that he is, often comes off as a boor and a brute. And on more than a couple of occasions, he seems intent on claiming women as his own whether they are willing or not. People often wonder about Robert E. Howard's own attitude towards women, which seems to have been a bit complicated. He had an on-again, off-again courtship with the schoolteacher Novelyn Price, but nothing ever came of this. Though he did seem to have gained his share of sexual experience in the brothels of the Texan frontier. However, in a letter where he goes over this subject in more detail, Howard actually subverts our expectations. When one of his friends expressed misogynistic attitudes, he responded forcefully. He asserted that women are the intellectual equals of men, and to illustrate his point, he went on in length about the achievements of those whom he considered to be the greatest women in history. It's an eclectic list that includes Sappho, Aspasia, Joan of Arc, Isabella of Castile, Catherine the Great, Emma Goldman, and Cato Hare. As for the way that female characters are portrayed in the Conan stories, it seems to have been mostly the result of commercial opportunism. A story was much more likely to be featured on the cover of Weird Tales if it included an attractive woman in a sticky situation. And paying closer attention to these stories, it's clear that characters that embody the feminine ideal of being weak and passive are treated with an evident degree of contempt and mockery by the narrative, which includes Conan having free license to do with them as he pleases. But they are contrasted with other female characters who are strong and independent, and are thus to be treated as equals. In fact, a few stories have arcs where Conan's stereotypically weak and hysterical female companion gains a backbone over the course of the adventure. And of course, it also goes without saying that because these strong, independent women have impeccable taste, all of them obviously want to sleep with Conan of their own volition. They make up some of Conan's most iconic love interests, like the characters of Belit in Queen of the Black Coast, or Valeria in Red Nails. And you know what? It probably wouldn't hurt to talk a little bit more about Red Nails, as it is probably one of the most iconic Conan stories, and it's also one that Robert E. Howard was very proud of. As he described it to H.P. Lovecraft, "The bloodiest and most sexy weird story I ever wrote. When or if you ever read it, I'd like to know how you like my handling of the subject of lesbianism." Here, Conan is adventuring in southern Africa, where he runs into his ex-lover, the pirate Valeria, and together they stumble upon the city of Shakotl, which for some reason shows strong Aztec influences. Here, the two are caught up in a convoluted web of politics and sorcery, and also receive a long explanation of the city's history, which Howard doubtlessly intended to serve as a grand statement about the nature of civilization, but which just ends up coming off as a bit of a mess. There are fights, there are monsters, there is attempted human sacrifice, and there is, of course, the subject of lesbianism, which ends up just being a brief scene where Valeria whips one of the Aztec women who tried to capture her. If Robert E. Howard's private poetry is any indication, female-on-female flagellation is a subject that he found to be very intriguing, especially when it crossed racial boundaries. But in the end, Conan and Valeria defeat the bad guys and make it out of the city together. Red Nails is perhaps the most quintessential Conan story, showing off both some of Howard's strongest writing and some of his most noticeable quirks. It is also the last Conan story he ever wrote. I tried to come up with a natural way to lead up to this, but different biographers all have their own speculation on what exactly was going on in Howard's mind leading up to this. But the fact is, on the 11th of June, 1936, Robert E. Howard took a pistol and shot himself in the head. He was 30 years old. Just 9 months later, H.P. Lovecraft would die of cancer at the age of 46. Clark Ashton Smith would live on until 1961, but at that point he had lost his passion for prose fiction, and his contributions to Weird Tales became infrequent. The magazine's best years were behind it, but it still went on. H.P. Lovecraft had many friends and admirers who tried to keep his legacy going, and of all of them, no one went further than August Derleth. He knew that in pulp magazines, fame was fleeting, so Derleth set up the publishing house Arkham Press to reprint Lovecraft's works in book form, alongside stories by himself and other authors set in what he dubbed the Cthulhu mythos. Now, these days, Derleth is quite unpopular, as in his stories he tries to condense Lovecraft's vast, amoral mythos into an easy-to-understand cosmology centered around a battle between the evil Great Old Ones and the benevolent Elder Gods, which goes against pretty much everything that Lovecraft's writings actually stood for. But at the same time, by keeping those original stories in print, Derleth is probably the main reason why anyone even remembers Lovecraft today. Robert E. Howard's Conan stories would also see a posthumous resurgence, but we still have a bit to go before we reach that point. In the time being, there would be fairly straightforward imitators like Clifford Bull's Dwar the Accursed, or Henry Kuttner's Eloch of Atlantis. There is also stuff with a more original spin, like Nick Sandalis's The Sapphire Goddess, a rather silly and campy story which manages to foreshadow a lot of later fantasy, featuring a Chosen One-style character who goes on an epic quest to reclaim his throne from an evil sorcerer. But the only one of these early sword and sorcery authors to come up with any lasting legacy was Catherine Lucille Moore. Her character, Jirel of Jory, is a noblewoman in medieval France, and also a warrior, who we're told is tall as most men and as savage as the wildest of them. She's set up as something of a gender-bent Conan, though the actual stories are more like something that Lovecraft or Smith would have wrote, focused on lavish descriptions of the strange, demonic dimensions where Jirel finds herself over the course of the stories. But over time, this type of fantasy became less and less common in the pages of Weird Tales. The magazine put more and more focus on conventional horror, alongside a bit of sci-fi. Over the next decade, it published some of the early works of Ray Bradbury, along with what I think is the first story ever published about traveling back in time to kill child Hitler. But nothing can last forever, and Weird Tales released its last issue in September 1954, which was coincidentally right between the release of Tolkien's The Fellowship of the Ring and The Two Towers. But in its heyday, Weird Tales was making a fair amount of money, and this attracted competitors. These knockoff magazines were mostly unremarkable, but there's one very notable exception, though for context, we need to step away from fantasy for just a moment and take a detour through its sibling genre, science fiction. In 1937, John Wood Campbell Jr. became the editor of Astounding Science Fiction, which, in fact, still operates today under the title Analog Science Fiction and Fact. Now, at this time, the genre was largely associated with either hackish, formulaic adventure stories in imitation of Edgar Rice Burroughs, or else the so-called gadget fiction of the dominant sci-fi editor at the time, Hugo Gernsback, which was so focused on describing speculative technology in extensive detail that it completely neglected having interesting plot lines or characters. But when it came to Astounding, Campbell set high standards for well-written, engaging stories that are scientifically plausible and also have some deeper philosophical or sociological message. Obviously, not every story could be a perfect success on all metrics, but Campbell made more effort than any other editor at the time to only publish the best of the best, He was dissatisfied with the work of most pre-established writers, and so he instead focused on cultivating new talent, which would include authors like Isaac Asimov, Robert A. Heinlein, and Arthur C. Clarke. With contributors like these, Astounding ushered in what came to be known as the Golden Age of science fiction. And in 1939, Campbell started a spin-off magazine called Unknown, later renamed to Unknown Worlds. This one is also freely available on the Internet Archive, and since there doesn't seem to be a pre-existing index, I created my own. Link to that in the description. Just as Astounding revolutionized science fiction, Unknown intended to revolutionize the market which was then dominated by weird tales, that is to say, speculative stories which are less concerned with scientific plausibility. The magazine only lasted for 4 years, and from that you can infer that it wasn't entirely successful in this goal, but it still sticks out for the approach it takes to fantasy. Whereas most of the stories we've covered up to this point have tried to recreate the feelings and style of old myths, fairy tales, and heroic epics, Campbell wanted to take the genre in a new direction. The classic ghost story type, Unknown Worlds rather tends to ignore because it has been too thoroughly formalized. Ghosts, vampires, werewolves, all the stock characters of stock fantasy horror have been so long cast in a stereotyped mold as to paralyze them. Unknown Worlds is trying to develop a more modern mythology. If we do discuss werewolves, why, let it be the troubles of a werewolf beset by an overzealous and highly efficient local dog catcher, laboring under a misapprehension as to his identity. If it's vampires you want, tradition doesn't explain what happens to a vampire subjected to X-ray bombardment, or treated to a dose of mustard gas, which has a garlic-like odor. To fulfill this vision, Campbell relied on the same cast of authors he cultivated in Astounding Science Fiction. H.L. Gold contributed the story Trouble with Water, where a water gnome lays a curse on a fisherman, which can only be lifted if he finds a way to give it sugar without it immediately dissolving in the water. In the times of fairy tales, this might have been an impossible task, but the fisherman figures that he can solve the dilemma by wrapping the sugar in plastic. L. Sprague de Camp wrote Nothing in the Rules, about the drama and hijinks that ensue when a coach at a competitive swimming competition recruits a mermaid into his team. And Robert Heinlein wrote the novella Devil Makes the Law, that takes place in a near-future America where magic is discovered to be real, and it quickly becomes an economically valuable service. The story centers around a nefarious professional association called Magic Incorporated, who lobby the state legislature to give them a legal monopoly on the use of magic, so that they can enact the most villainous scheme in all of fiction, and take advantage of the lack of competition to overcharge customers. What developed here was fantasy, written with the mindset of a science fiction author, someone who is focused on exploring the logical consequences of what would actually happen if this type of magic was real, though it's usually written in a rather light-hearted tone, as they're fully aware that the whole concept is a bit silly. Probably the most successful of these stories was a collaboration between L. Sprague de Camp and Fletcher Pratt, following the misadventures of one Harold Shea, who learns the secret of traveling to other dimensions, which over the course of the series brings him to the worlds of the Norse Eddas, of Edmund Spenser's The Fairy Queen, Ludovico Ariosto's Orlando Furioso, the Finnish Kalevala, and the Irish myths of Cuchulainn. Shea finds that modern technology is rendered useless in these worlds because they operate on their own magical laws, which are different from the physics of our own world. But, as he discovers, these magical laws still follow a consistent, predictable pattern, and so he tries to learn and exploit them for himself, usually to comical results. In these stories, we have one of the earliest examples of what we now call hard magic. Fantasy where magic operates according to predictable, understandable rules. This is contrasted with soft magic, which we've seen in pretty much every previous story, where magic is presented as something that's inherently vague and irrational. Though I will say, for any hard magic fans out there who wanna flip through the pages of Unknown Worlds to get back to the source, you'll probably be disappointed, as it's a style that, at this point, is very much still in its infancy. There are some fun moments, like when Shea tries to summon a dragon, but keeps getting the quantitative aspect of the spell wrong. First, he accidentally summons 100 dragons, then he overcorrects and only summons a tiny dragon, 1/100th the size of a normal one. But overall, the rules and limitations aren't nearly as well fleshed out, or explained clearly, or used to solve obstacles in the story in the same way that we've come to expect of modern hard magic systems. The mere concept that there could be consistent rules and limitations to magic in a fictional fantasy setting was such a novel concept that it got readers' attention, and it even attracted imitators within the magazine. I said earlier that H.P. Lovecraft was probably the one name in this video who most viewers would recognize. Well, there is one other, someone who's best known for other work, but who got their start in the pulps. Lafayette Ronald Hubbard. And funnily enough, he and Lovecraft did apparently meet each other at a gathering of writers in New York. It seemed to have been quite the meeting of minds, and Lovecraft's friend, Frank Belknap Long, would later recall that Lovecraft remarked to him, "That is a remarkable young man." In 1938, John W. Campbell recruited Hubbard into the Astounding Science Fiction Circle, which naturally led to him also becoming a contributor to Unknown Worlds. At this point, he had produced a novel-length manuscript titled Excalibur, a fantasy story which he would later claim was so mind-shatteringly extraordinary that any other person who read it was compelled to commit suicide. Lucky for me, as I flipped through Unknown, Excalibur was never published, and instead, Hubbard mainly contributed stories about schlubby American men who are magically transported to Oriental wonderlands. The most memorable of these is probably The Case of the Friendly Corpse. Here, a bored, unambitious college student named Jules Riley switches bodies with Ahmed Al-Mahoud, a student at the University of Unholy Names. Having just earned his Doctor of Inhumanities, he must take an exam to join the diabolical, extra-dimensional, and mysterious order of necromancers and sorcerers, or demons for short. Hijinks quickly ensue, partially involving the society of this world where murder and treachery are considered virtues, and partially involving Jules' missteps in learning the rules of magic, which, as indicated in the title, includes a partially botched resurrection spell. In that aspect, it has a similar feel to the Harold Shea stories, but Hubbard evidently had confidence that he had executed the concept better, and he even included a offhand mention that Harold Shea had previously visited this world, only to immediately get eaten by a giant snake. It's generally considered a dick move to write a story where you kill another author's character off-screen, and for a time, this was L. Ron Hubbard's greatest public controversy. That is, of course, until 1950, when his quest for greater fame and fortune than can be acquired in the pulps led him to develop Dianetics, the modern science of mental health. Most of the Astounding Circle saw this as clear quackery, but he did recruit a cadre to his cause, which included John W. Campbell himself. This support would fade away by the time Dianetics was converted into the Church of Scientology in 1953, but Campbell did not learn his lesson, and he only grew more crankish as the years went on, and eventually his attention would turn to politics. Now, during the height of Astounding and Unknown, there was plenty of stuff that would make a modern reader do a double take, but nothing that matched the egregious racism that we saw in Weird Tales. But by the 1960s, it seems that Campbell wanted to make up for lost time, and he started filling the pages of the magazine with editorials, where he mostly ranted about his opposition to civil rights activism. This has quite understandably marred his present-day reputation, but it's also impossible to deny his role in the history of speculative fiction, in completely reshaping the genre of science fiction, and in coming up with a new take on fantasy, a rational, deconstructionist approach which has gone on to evolve and be developed in a plethora of later works, ranging from Discworld to Dungeon Meshi. In fact, I'd say that these later stories play with the concept so well that the stuff in Unknown Worlds comes off as underwhelming by comparison. Whereas the stories in Weird Tales, despite their flaws, still have a certain quality to them that you just don't get in modern fantasy, I can't really say the same about Unknown Worlds, which, in my opinion at least, just comes off as a less mature version of the stuff we get today. In essence, it walked so that they could run. But I should also mention that while this kind of rational fantasy is what the magazine was best known for, not every story fit perfectly into that mold. When you're putting out 164 pages on a monthly basis, you inevitably have to compromise on content. And some of the stories in Unknown Worlds feel very similar to the type published in Weird Tales. In one case, Campbell purchased the story from Arthur J. Burks, but upon reading through it a second time, he decided that he actually didn't like it that much. So he made substantial revisions and published it as The Elder Gods, using his own pseudonym, Don A. Stewart. The story takes place in a far future, post-cataclysmic version of Earth, where a man named Darren is caught in the middle of a conflict between two rival pantheons of gods. And the existence of these gods is explained quasi-scientifically as a parapsychological phenomenon fueled by the belief of their worshippers. Essentially, it introduces the idea that the more worship that a god receives, the more powerful they become. But this story was not the most notable instance of sword and sorcery in Unknown Worlds. Fritz Leiber Jr. and Harry Otto Fisher were a couple of nerdy friends who were fans of Edgar Rice Burroughs and Weird Tales. They liked to bounce ideas off each other in letters, and in 1934, Fisher thought up a duo of heroes modeled after themselves. Leiber as Fafford, a mighty barbarian from the northern wastes, and himself as the Grey Mouser, a small, confident, streetwise rogue. In turn, they would both have supernatural patrons, Ningobble of the Seven Eyes for Fafford and Shielba of the Eyeless Face for the Grey Mouser, who would send them off on various quests. Fisher was full of ideas, but he lacked the wherewithal to actually write a full story, so Leiber was the one who brought the concept into fruition. He began to write stories and gain a grasp of the characters, but he was less sure about where exactly these adventures should take place. He played around with different ideas and generally leaned towards somewhere in the classical Mediterranean. But in 1936, he got in touch with H.P. Lovecraft of all people and got him to review an early draft of one of these stories, Adept's Gambit. Along with some other feedback, Lovecraft provided him a reading list to familiarize himself with ancient history. The list was quite long, and it made Leiber think that maybe it would be easier to invent his own setting. And around the same time, he and Fisher began working on Lankhmar, a war game that incorporated many elements from the Fafhrd and Grey Mouser concept. Players take the role of heroes who move across the map on various quests, with the end goal of taking over the map of this fictional land of Nerhuan, centered around the great city of Lankhmar. The game itself was a flop, but Leiber now had a setting for his stories. There was no success in submitting the Fafhrd and Grey Mouser stories to Weird Tales, but once Unknown got started, he managed to get the story Two Sought Adventure published in the August 1939 issue. It was the year of the behemoth, the month of the hedgehog, the day of the toad. A hot, late summer sun was sinking down towards the evening on the somber, fertile land of Lankhmar, the most civilized country in a world which history forgets. Whereas most stories in Unknown Worlds were written in a very simple, straightforward manner, the Fafhrd and Grey Mouser stories stand out for their more stylized prose. In particular, they remind me of Lord Dunsany from back in Part 1, with that same kind of reverse bathos. These are, on one hand, epic stories of sword and sorcery, about exciting acts of heroic daring-do, and on the other, they're described in this whimsical manner that implies that you're not supposed to take it too seriously. But yet, neither of these moods undermines the other. Like in Dunsany, they manage to coexist simultaneously. I'll also say that, like Dunsany, the stories tend to be rather slow-paced, more focused on absorbing you into the atmosphere than they are on moving the plot along, which can be a bit of a acquired taste. But overall, the Fafhrd and Grey Mouser stories follow a similar format to Conan. Our heroes are a pair of rogues who wander the world in search of riches, and inevitably end up fighting against wizards, ghosts, or, in a couple of cases, Lankhmar's notorious Thieves' Guild, which is a term that it seems Leiber coined himself. But while our heroes are definitely skilled swordsmen, they don't have the same level of superhuman strength as Conan to let them solve literally any problem by slashing their way through it. They frequently find themselves outmatched and must use their wits to come up with creative solutions to their problems. And as opposed to the raw, gritty tone of Conan, Leiber's style is far more polished, with more of a fun, swashbuckling feel. And this was evidently a successful formula, as he'd continue writing these stories until 1988, nearly half a century after the initial publication of Two Sought Adventure. And funnily enough, the final Fafhrd and Grey Mouser story, The Mouser Goes Below, would, much like the final Conan story Red Nails, feature what I describe as an uncomfortably voyeuristic scene of sapphic flagellation. I'm not sure if this was an intentional homage, or just a common thread in terms of the type of guy who writes sword and sorcery fantasy. And of course, Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser would far outlast the magazine where they got their start. Unknown Worlds never sold as well as Astounding Science Fiction did, and with the wartime paper shortage of the 1940s, it became financially unviable. The final issue was published in October 1943, featuring the novel The Book of Thoth by A.E. Van Vogt. This story takes a rather similar premise as Campbell's own The Elder Gods, but makes it about 5 times more convoluted. Millions of years into the future, humanity lives on the supercontinent of Gondwana alongside reborn dinosaurs. They are ruled by the immortal god king Thoth, along with his 2 goddess wives Anesnia and Leone, who by some sci-fi mechanism receive power from the worship of their subjects. Anesnia has managed to depose the other 2 deities to rule as sole despot. However, Tat is still wandering around Gondwana with his body inhabited by the mind of a contemporary American soldier from the 1940s. And in his quest to reclaim his throne, he also has the aid of his other wife, Leone, who was slain by Anesnia but is now a disembodied spirit with the ability to possess the bodies of other women. Honestly, if I was running the magazine that published The Book of Thoth, I would also say, yep, it's clear we're out of good ideas for fantasy stories, it's time to put a wrap on the whole thing. But for better or worse, this wasn't the end of fantasy. By the conclusion of the Second World War, Unknown Worlds had gone out of business and Weird Tales was on the decline, but fantasy crept along as essentially a subgenre of science fiction. Sci-fi magazines were proliferating thanks to the success of Astounding, and while some of them were very strict about scientific plausibility, others were willing to let a bit of fantasy slip through the cracks. Most of these stories were of a familiar fare where a character from Earth is dragged into a magical world and goes out on some action-filled adventure. There's not too much interesting to say about Henry Kuttner's The Dark World, or Stanley Mullen's Kinsmen of the Dragon, but there's one author who stands out for their level of ambition, if nothing else. Someone who made an attempt, even if it was ultimately futile, to bring the genre in a new direction. Murray Fletcher Pratt. We mentioned him earlier as the co-author of the Harold Shea stories in Unknown Worlds, but this was only a small aspect of his career. During his lifetime, he was best known as a military historian and analyst. He even invented his own naval war game, and regularly played in his apartment with friends, including L. Sprague de Camp, L. Ron Hubbard, and Isaac Asimov. In that apartment, he also had a room where he kept marmosets. That isn't really relevant to anything, but it still felt important to mention. As an aficionado of science fiction and fantasy, he greatly admired British authors of imaginary worlds like Lord Dunsany and E.R. Edison. This, along with work he was undertaking on a biography of King Voldemort IV of Denmark, combined to form the basis of his own fantasy novel, something with more gravitas than that which was being offered in the pulp market. This would become The Well of the Unicorn, published in 1948. In the introduction, Pratt explains that the story is set in the same continuity as Lord Dunsany's play King Orgomenes and the Unknown Warrior. We're told that after the events of the play, Orgomenes went on to form an empire, to which Pratt gives us a map, providing us with yet another entry in the classic tradition of westwards-facing blobular continents. The setting overall is strongly reminiscent of medieval Europe, complete with a monotheistic church and an empire that's something of a cross between the Holy Roman and Byzantine empires. It nominally rules over a vast landmass, but its power is mostly symbolic, and the administration of the pseudo-Scandinavian land of Dalarna, where the story takes place, is instead carried out by the tyrannical Viking tribe. And if you're wondering how to pronounce all these made-up names, Pratt gives us a helpful guide. This is the reader's book. All proper names are therefore to be pronounced in any way he chooses, except in conversation with another reader, in which case the two must settle their differences as best they can, for there is no rule. The story proper begins with our protagonist, Irar Alvarsson, being forced out of his ancestral home by Fulking taxation. In his subsequent travels, he falls in with a magician, the learned Dr. Meliboe, who positions him as the leader of a small company of rebels. With this company, he spends much of the book on a ship, journeying across the coastline of Dalarna. And I should also mention that The Well of the Unicorn is yet another book that tries to emulate an archaic prose style. But compared to other authors who have made this choice, Pratt's writing lacks any poetic quality, which makes the whole thing come off as supremely awkward. But once you get past this, you end up with a rather meandering story, where our hero is faced with a long series of moral dilemmas. Pratt seems dedicated to tearing down all the romanticized tropes of heroic fantasy, which I suppose makes sense for someone who spent a lot of time studying the grim details of military history. Irar's journey is miserable, and his supposed companions are often untrustworthy. Each one tries to push him in a different direction, but he is always unsure which course of action is best to advance their goal of overthrowing the Fulkings, if that is even a desirable outcome at all. The title of the book comes from The Well of the Unicorn, which never actually appears in the story, but is frequently mentioned. We're told that this well, in some mystical way, gives peace to those who drink from it, and that any two people who have both drunk from the well are compelled to never go to war against each other. The stability and peace of the Empire is attributed to the well, but because the people of Dalarna are proud warrior folk, they refuse to drink from it. And I should also mention that very few of these details about the world are given to us directly. You see, Pratt shies away from straightforward exposition, and instead expects us to pick up all of the nuances of the world through context clues and the way characters speak about them. This is quite a different approach from even the examples of soft world building that we've discussed earlier, as even they don't hesitate to give us direct exposition when it's for something that's essential to understanding the plot. However, Pratt doesn't feel any obligation to make the story easy to understand, and mixed with the book's awkward prose, this makes it rather difficult to follow. But by the end of it, Irar seems to have won. He defeats the Fulkings in battle, becomes Lord of the Land, and marries Argira, a princess of the Empire. However, Pratt is not content to give us a happily ever after. So it was victory, and Dalarna free, Avides the Carhone released from durance and glory everlasting, and one might think that the tale ended there. Not so. It ends some time farther on, with the red leaves of autumn blowing and a messenger in the house of the city of Naros, where the master of Dalarna drinks sweet wine. Lord Irar, there is a great invasion of heathen ships from Geek into the Jatebi Isles, with magics that make our men afraid, and the heathen swear that you not having the peace of the well, they are not in treaty with you. Argira, my dear lord and love, will you not drink of the well with me and them, and put all of this down? Said Irar, we will summon the levy of Mariola and Vastmanstead. There is no peace but that interior in us, and wondered why she wept. Sales of The Well of the Unicorn were extremely poor. This is often attributed to the fact that publishers forced Pratt to use a pen name, George U. Fletcher, which means that the book didn't reach many of his pre-existing fans. But I also think that a lot of it has to do with the fact that the book is, frankly, not very enjoyable to read. Much of it is spent with Irar and his companions sailing around and getting into arguments, without much in the way of stakes or a sense of direction to get the reader invested in the story. Though even I have to admit that there are compelling elements to the book. Specifically, in the way it tries to deconstruct the typical heroic structure, it's the earliest fantasy story I've come across that really emphasizes psychological and sociological realism. All of the other invented worlds that we've gone over have been idolized to a large degree. The Lord of the Rings is famously about a battle between pure good versus pure evil, which Tolkien himself was fully aware was greatly simplified from how the real world works. Other fantasies like The Worm Ouroboros or Conan the Barbarian have a grittier tone, but they still focus on a highly romantic ideal of a strong, powerful hero who can step in and instantly turn all wrongs to right. Lovecraft and Smith wrote more pessimistic stories, but those are about over-the-top, surreal horrors that feel far removed from the struggles we face in real life. It's really in The Well of the Unicorn that we really see the idea that this might be a magical fantasy world, but its people and society are just as complicated and messy as in our own world. Its heroes are just as fallible as ourselves, and its conflicts don't have easy solutions. And although it didn't really catch on, Pratt wasn't finished. In 1952, he served as editor of Witches 3, an anthology of 3 supernatural stories. Conjure Wife by our old friend Fritz Leiber, about women in a college town doing witchcraft. There Shall Be No Darkness by James Blish, which provides a sci-fi take on werewolves, and most relevant for us, The Blue Star by Pratt himself. In the prologue to this novel, a group of men in our own world speculate about the idea of alternate timelines. They decide that even if it was possible to go back in time and reshape the past, to change the outcome of a battle, or to prevent a famous person from being born, it wouldn't actually make much of a difference, as history is ultimately determined by macro-level material forces, rather than individual actions. That is, with one exception, the invention of gunpowder, which was, in their view at least, a freak occurrence that changed the course of history, and without which much of our modern science and technology would not exist. However, a world without gunpowder would not necessarily be more primitive than our own. The creative energy that went into the Industrial Revolution surely would have gone somewhere else instead. Maybe alternate fields of science that are less developed in our own timeline, like extrasensory perception. And of course, it should be taken for granted that magic would be primarily practiced by women, leading to a matriarchal society, but one that would fall apart as matriarchies are inherently unstable, leading to the rise of a patriarchal society that strongly resists magic. If you feel like there's lots of weird leaps of logic here, then don't worry, that's exactly what I was thinking as I was reading all this. But in any case, as soon as they go to sleep that night, all of these men share a dream of events taking place in that very world. Much like in The Well of the Unicorn, there's very little exposition to explain how this world works, and instead we have to figure it out from context. We know that certain women have the ability of witchcraft, a psychological power which mainly allows them to cast charms to compel behavior in others. A witch's power is hereditary, passing from mother to daughter once the daughter loses her virginity. Some families possess a gem called a blue star, which grants the witch's lover powers of his own, so long as he remains faithful to her. It's a rather odd system, but it represents something of a step forward in the development of hard magic that started in Unknown Worlds. This is the first fantasy story I've come across to set limits on what is and isn't possible with magic. In most early fantasy, it seems that magicians' abilities encompass just about anything you can think of. They can do divination, they can raise the dead, they can summon evil spirits. But in the Blue Star, witches are limited to a relatively small array of psychological abilities. This is also an early story where magic is portrayed as an inherent inborn ability, which is quite a popular trope in today's fantasy, as opposed to it being a skill that anyone can learn, or something that's granted through a pact with a supernatural being. This is also an early setting where these hereditary magic users are suppressed by a religious authority, who are, in this case, the Episcopals, a not-so-subtle stand-in for the Catholic Church. However, not everyone is loyal to the Episcopals' teachings. There are witches about, and if they have a blue star, then any ambitious man will want to get his hands on it. The story takes place in the land of Netznagon, vaguely reminiscent of 1700s Europe. And here, there's a society of liberal revolutionaries who call themselves the Sons of the New Day. They have learned of a young woman named Lilette, whose family possesses a blue star, so naturally, they send one of their own, a clerk named Rodvard, to seduce her. He then does this by forcing himself upon her until she stops resisting. With this, he wins control of the Blue Star, which gives him the ability to read other people's darkest thoughts. The narrative portrays this action as morally dubious, but not unforgivable. Rodvard is still portrayed as a hero, and his relationship with Lilette as a romance, though I guess you could say that he does get a taste of his own medicine. When revolutionary plots go astray, Rodvard is estranged from Lilette, and they separately decide to flee to the heretic kingdom of Montreal, and on the boat there, Rodvard narrowly escapes the advances of the ship's sodomite captain. I should mention that homosexuality is something that comes up with unexpected frequency in Pratt's writing. There's another instance where Rodvard is reading people's minds, and he's disgusted to come across a plotting lesbian. And then, in The Well of the Unicorn, we have characters like the devious sodomite Plander, or the ineffectual twink Prince Aurorius. All of these characters are portrayed in a decisively negative manner, but it's also important to acknowledge that this is an era where you couldn't really get away with positive gay representation. Generally, writers preferred to ignore the existence of same-sex attraction altogether. We've gotten a very subtle bit of gal-on-gal action in previous stories, but nothing as explicit as Pratt's portrayals. So the fact that he keeps bringing it up again and again means something. I tried reading up on him to dig up any clues on what intentions he might have had, but I couldn't find anything on the topic, so we can only speculate. In any case, Rodvard and Lilette both end up in Montreal, which is ruled by a heretical sect that feels like a mix between Gnosticism and Calvinism. They believe in a dualistic theology between the god of love and the god of evil, with followers expected to fully dedicate themselves to the god of love, which in practice means fulfilling their social role without any regard for their own interests or pleasures. Rodvard is assigned to a clerical position, but Lilette finds herself pressured into what is essentially the role of a sex slave, expected to take care of the physical needs of initiates so that they can focus their minds on holy scholarship. There is a lot going on here, and yet Pratt takes barely any time to explore it. Almost as soon as they've arrived, Rodvard and Lilette are informed that revolution has finally come to Netznagon, and so the Sons of the New Day whisk them back to their home country. With his ability to read minds thanks to the Blue Star, Rodvard is a natural fit for the Committee of Public Safety, but he cannot help but notice as the revolution seems to be spiraling out of control, with moderate and radical factions at each other's throats, threatening to break out into mass bloodshed. And so, Rodvard and Lilette decide that their love for each other is more important than magic or politics. and the story ends with them throwing the blue star into the water. The Blue Star is a more engaging read than The Well of the Unicorn, if only because of its more straightforward prose style, but it still suffers from many of the same flaws. My judgment is obviously colored by my own personal taste, but from reading reviews, there seems to be a general consensus that there's lots of interesting concepts at play, but the plotting execution makes it difficult to really get invested in the story. It's the type of book where it's more enjoyable to listen to a plot summary than it is to read the actual thing. The end result feels like a real missed opportunity. The Well of the Unicorn and The Blue Star came out only a few years before The Lord of the Rings, so the appetite was definitely there for this type of ambitious fantasy epic. And in an alternate reality where Pratt did a few more rounds of revision to really polish it up, it's possible that one of these books would have caught on, that with this more grounded take on the genre, he could have become a foundational figure in fantasy alongside J.R.R. Tolkien and Robert E. Howard. But in the real world where we do find ourselves, Fletcher Pratt would make his greatest mark on the genre through a more indirect avenue. Pratt was an avid reader of all sorts of science fiction and fantasy. At one point, he came across a republished edition of Conan the Conqueror by the late Robert E. Howard. Pratt was deeply unimpressed by it, finding this type of straightforward, heroic fantasy to be unsophisticated. And so he pawned it off to his friend Leon Sprague de Camp, who you'll remember as his co-author for the Harold Shea stories. De Camp was an engineer by trade, and in his works of science fiction and fantasy, he was known for taking a logical, rationalistic approach. One of his most well-regarded stories was Lest Darkness Fall, a Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court-style story, where the protagonist is transported to 6th century Italy and becomes convinced that he can prevent the onset of the Dark Ages by defending the kingdom of the Ostrogoths from being conquered by Emperor Justinian. He also wrote the Viagens Interplanetarius series, meant to provide a more scientifically plausible take on the planetary romance genre. When collaborating on the Harold Shea stories, he later said that Fletcher Pratt was the one who brought a deep knowledge of classic literature and mythology, while he was the one who came up with ideas for the types of hijinks that could occur with a logically consistent magic system. At the time he read Conan the Conqueror, he was even working on Lost Continents, a non-fiction book debunking theosophic ideas of Atlantis and Lemuria. His career up to this point had been based around stories that emphasized brain over brawn, but Robert E. Howard's writing seems to have awakened something in him, and he became obsessed with sword and sorcery. De Camp's initial stab at the genre came through a series of stories that would be collected together in The Tritonian Ring and Other Pusadian Tales. In the title story, The Tritonian Ring, our hero, Prince Vakar, must journey across Bronze Age Europe and Africa to find the Tritonian Ring that will save his island kingdom of Pusad from being lost beneath the waves. But in this quest, he is opposed by the gods themselves. Their power comes from the belief of their worshippers, and they suspect that Vakar's quest is going to threaten their position. In typical De Camp fashion, the story mixes obscure references to ancient history and ethnography, together with a bunch of stuff that's extremely goofy. One of Vakar's most memorable foes is Awakis, king of the Proto-Egyptian kingdom of Neowat, who is so insecure about his height that he's beheaded all of his subjects and reanimated them as zombies who are, needless to say, short ahead. By the end of his journey, Vakar obtains something even greater than the ring. A sword made of meteor iron, a substance which banishes the power of the supernatural, thus ushering in the end of the Bronze Age and the beginning of a new, more rational Iron Age. But upon returning home to Passad, Vakar finds that during his time away, his throne was usurped by his brother, with widespread support from the rest of the populace. And at this point, he decides to give up and simply leave the island to its fate. On the whole, it's a rather fun and wacky story. However, it also contains what may be the worst line I have ever read in any book, when describing the physical appearance of Vakar's love interest. Though small, she had a form that practically demanded rape of any passing male. But this wasn't the end of DeCamp's sword and sorcery obsession. Although his initial foray into the genre was rather farcical, he couldn't escape the more raw and sincere appeal of Conan, and he became closely involved in efforts to recover old manuscripts and get them published in book form. He ended up playing a very similar role in promoting the works of Robert E. Howard as August Derleth did with H.P. Lovecraft. And by the 1960s, he, along with his protege Lin Carter, managed to get a Conan series published by Lancer Books, mixing Howard's stories with original work by him and Carter meant to fill in the gaps. And this series was the start of Conan's rise as a media empire, being adapted into comics by Marvel in the 1970s, and then portrayed on screen by Arnold Schwarzenegger in the 1980s. And in the meantime, DeCamp and Carter would also write extensively about the history of fantasy, to the point that while I was doing research for this video, their books were, to this day, some of the most comprehensive resources available. But like August Derleth, DeCamp also has passionate detractors. His interpretation of Conan brought the character into mainstream popularity, but it's also widely agreed that he fails to quite catch the spirit of Robert E. Howard's original stories. He smooths over the nuances and philosophical underpinnings of the character to present a simplified vision of this hypermasculine action hero. Something that's definitely an aspect of the original, but in later stories gets taken to the point of self-parody. This is most apparent in visual adaptations, where Conan is almost always shown going around naked, save for a loincloth. Whereas in the original stories, he just wore clothes and armor like a normal person. And with so much bare skin showing, you also have a good view of his absurdly toned muscles, which make him look less like a Bronze Age warrior, and more like a bodybuilder who's taken an unsafe dosage of anabolic steroids and hasn't drunk any water in the past week. And meanwhile, DeCamp's work into the history of fantasy is valuable for all the primary sources he manages to dig up, but his analysis is highly questionable. As mentioned, DeCamp was an engineer by profession, and as is, let's be honest, pretty typical, he placed an over-high value on his own opinions. And his biographies of other authors are full of armchair psychoanalysis and broad claims that aren't really supported by any evidence. But for better or worse, DeCamp remains a pivotal figure in the history of fantasy, especially in the development of sword and sorcery, which perhaps never would have gotten off the ground if he wasn't there to serve as its main champion from the 50s onwards. In 1963, he'd even send an anthology of sword and sorcery stories to J.R.R. Tolkien, and from Tolkien's personal notes, we know that he did read them, and had some opinions. He enjoyed the setup of C.L. Moore's Geralt of Rivia story Hellsguard, but was dissatisfied with the ending. Meanwhile, he dismissed Clark Ashton Smith's The Testament of Artemis out of hand, describing it as wholly unbelievable and disgusting. And DeCamp claimed that Tolkien later told him in person that he rather liked the Robert E. Howard Conan story Shadows in the Moonlight. But you might be wondering, if we have L. Sprague de Camp to champion Robert E. Howard, and August Derleth to champion H.P. Lovecraft, who was there for the final member of the triumvirate, Clark Ashton Smith? Well, no one really. That's why he remains comparatively obscure. But he did have something of a spiritual successor, someone who would carry on many of the same tropes and themes. Jack Vance. He'd grown up as a fan of weird tales, and while serving in the Merchant Marine during World War II, he spent his spare time writing stories of his own in a similar mold. After the war, as he tried to make his name as a science fiction writer, he put these stories together in a book titled The Dying Earth, published in 1950. Millions of years into the future, countless civilizations on Earth have arisen and collapsed, each one delving deeper into the secrets of the cosmos, to the point that there is no longer a line between science and magic. But all things must come to an end, and at the time of these stories, humanity lies in a particularly degraded state, with scarcely populated settlements scattered across the world, surrounded by wilderness inhabited by monsters and demons. Awaiting the inevitable apocalypse when the dimming red sun finally goes black, the last of humanity live in primitive conditions, while magicians in their towers hoard what little remains of ancient knowledge. The book itself is a collection of 6 stories that each feel a bit like a dark fairy tale. Despite the grimness of the setting, the heroes generally end up winning in the end, while villains get their just desserts. Though, in the sequels, Vance would end up taking the series in a more darkly humorous direction, especially when it comes to the tales of Kugel the Clever, a roguish anti-hero whose complete lack of any redeeming features results in what I can only describe as a fantasy version of It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia. Vance's writing also stands out for its unique prose style, which is distinctively more florid than the norm for pulp sci-fi, but is also not nearly as dense as Clark Ashton Smith's. It feels poetic while still being approachable, which is a large factor in the popularity of his work. And as for The Dying Earth itself, Vance follows a very similar approach to Clark Ashton Smith in terms of soft world building. There's a very distinctive atmosphere to the stories, but in terms of actual lore, we're only limited to very brief snippets. However, Vance is uncharacteristically specific in describing the way spellcasting works. Wizards must study spells in old tomes. After they memorize one, it is stuck in their head, and there's only a limited number of spells they can keep there at any given time. And as a side note, these spells always have very memorable names, like Fandol's Gyrator, Feligen's second hypnotic spell, the excellent prismatic spray, the charm of untiring nourishment, and the spell of the omnipotent spear. Once they cast any of these spells, it is banished from their memory, and in order to repeat it, they must go back to their books and study it again. I imagine that this system will sound a bit familiar to many of you, but before we get to that, there's just one more author that we need to go over. If we dig deep enough, I'm sure we can find many more examples of pre-Tolkien secondary world fantasy in the pulps. If there's any noteworthy ones I left out, let me know in the comments. But this video has already gotten long enough, so the last one I'll tell you about is Poul Anderson. Much like Pratt, DeCamp, and Vance, he was primarily a writer of science fiction, but like them, he also felt the allure of fantasy. And in this case, he was a proud Danish American and felt a strong connection to Norse history and myth. This is apparent in Three Hearts and Three Lions, a novella published in 1953 in Fantasy and Science Fiction magazine, later expanded into a full novel in 1961. The story follows Holger Carlson, a Danish resistance fighter in World War II. After being shot in a gunfight with Nazis, he finds himself transported to a mythical version of medieval Europe. Here, humanity, representing the cosmic force of law, is locked in stagnant warfare with the realm of Fairy, representing the cosmic force of chaos. Journeying across this land, he picks up companions, including the Swan Maiden Eleonora and the dwarf Hugi. Dwarves here are a bit different from the type that would be popularized by Tolkien. We're told that they live in the woods and make friends with forest creatures. But notably, when Anderson writes Hugi's dialogue, he types it out with a Scottish accent. This is a small detail that's never associated with Tolkien's dwarves, but has become common in modern fantasy. Now, to summarize the story on the whole, it suffices to say that it's quite similar to the type that was published back in Unknown Worlds. It follows Holger in his travels as he uses his modern, scientific mindset to his advantage in this magical world. In one memorable scene, he defeats a dragon by pouring water down its throat, reasoning that if it can breathe fire, then the temperature there must be high enough to create a boiler explosion. But like many pulp authors, Poul Anderson had a high output, and in the next year, 1954, he came out with a new fantasy novel, The Broken Sword. And it's evident that he was capable of great versatility. While both this and Three Hearts and Three Lions are inspired by Northern European mythology, they diverge sharply beyond that. You can see this in the very first paragraph, where Anderson abandons the casual, pulpy style of his early work, and instead opts for something more reminiscent of the Old Norse sagas. The Broken Sword partially takes place in Danelaw, England, and partially in the land of Fairy, where the gods and creatures of Norse mythology live alongside those of other traditions. Now, at first, I wasn't really sure if this really fell under the scope of this video, where I'm trying to focus on works that feel directly comparable to The Lord of the Rings, which usually means that they should be set outside of Earth as we know it. But after looking more into The Broken Sword, I decided that I couldn't not talk about it. This is partially due to the date it was published, the 5th of November, 1954, about 3 months after the release of The Fellowship of the Ring, and 6 days before The Two Towers. And then, the book makes use of some similar subject matter as The Lord of the Rings, but with very different execution. You see, this book revolves around elves. And now, as for the ancient Norse interpretation of elves, we actually have very little to go off. Surviving texts don't really say much other than the basic fact that there are beings called Ulfar who live in a place called Ulfhamr. But Anderson does his best to create a version of elves that fits in with the spirit of Norse mythology, as opposed to later Victorian interpretations. Elves in The Broken Sword are not gentle beings. Lacking any human sense of inhibition, they drink, revel, and fornicate freely, and they go out raiding and reaving in the realms of other magical people. They are as terrible as they are beautiful, and speaking of their physical appearance, Anderson also tells us that these elves have long, pointed ears, which you might think goes without saying, but this is actually never explicitly said in other works like Dunsany's The King of Elfland's Daughter or Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings. Though it also isn't an idea that Anderson invented himself. The pointed ears motif had been common in artistic representations of elves and fairies since the 1800s, so it would seem that even this book isn't entirely free of Victorian influence. Our main protagonist is Skafloc, who was abducted by these elves as a child. As a result of this, he actually lives a pretty good life as the fosterling of the Elven King. But the thing is, when he was abducted, a changeling was put in his place to be raised by his human family, a troll child who was christened as Volgard. He grows up to be violent and ill-adjusted, and once he figures out the truth of his heritage, he joins up with the trolls in their war against the elves. Volgard takes his foster sister Freda as prisoner, but she is soon rescued by Skafloc, who, unbeknownst to either of them, is her biological brother. I'll give you a small hint that this doesn't end well. And as Ulfheim is captured by trolls, Skafloc goes on a quest for the broken sword Tyrfing, which has great powers, but is also prophesied to bring a terrible doom upon its wielder. I'll give you a small hint that this also does not end well. Whereas The Lord of the Rings is the progenitor of epic fantasy about the triumph of good over evil, The Broken Sword is often cited as a foundational work of what we now call grimdark. This is a tendency in speculative fiction that emphasizes violence, moral ambiguity, and a general sense that things are bad and there's no hope of them ever getting better. To a certain extent, this characterization is pretty fair. This is a story about medieval warfare, with characters that have little concern for modern morality. Characters like the vainglorious Skafloc, who acts on his passions even when everyone around him warns that this will lead to ruin. Or the monstrous Fulgard, who at times seems to feel remorse for his actions, but has dedicated himself too far to this path to turn back now. Throughout the story, characters are killed, they are tortured, their hopes and dreams are destroyed in a way that stands out even next to other gritty pulp stories at the time. But I've also found that the term grimdark has a certain reputation of works that are persistently dark and hopeless, intent on wallowing in misery to the extent that the end result is utterly unenjoyable to read. However, I feel like The Broken Sword avoids this trap. It's a fast-paced book that's too busy jumping from event to event to spend much time wallowing in the misery created. And whereas modern grimdark is sometimes known for being joyless and self-serious, The Broken Sword has much of the flamboyance you'd see in ancient myth. The story may be rather grim and dark, but this doesn't get in the way of it being an engaging and enjoyable read. And naturally, people will often pit The Lord of the Rings and The Broken Sword against each other. The patron saint of grimdark versus the founder of optimistic good versus evil fantasy. Though, personally, I find it hard to directly compare them. The Lord of the Rings is an epic trilogy, whereas The Broken Sword is a relatively short pulp novel. Each of them has their own strengths in different areas. I should also note that Tolkien's writing isn't nearly as happy and uplifting as his detractors make it out to be. In fact, The Broken Sword has strong parallels with his posthumously published The Children of Húrin, no doubt due to their shared mythological influences. And at the end of the day, The Broken Sword is a cult classic, but The Lord of the Rings would become the most successful work of fantasy ever published. Exactly what it is that sets it apart from every other story we've discussed so far is a complicated question. You could point to the sheer depth of the world, which plunges the reader into an invented mythology, history, and languages with a level of detail that surpasses anything that came before it. You could point to the way it centers around an epic, apocalyptic battle between good and evil in a way that wasn't really present in previous fantasy, but which evidently taps into something deep in the collective unconscious. You could point to a wide range of factors that could probably be covered in a whole other video. Feel free to give your own thoughts in the comments. As soon as The Lord of the Rings was published in 1954, it was generally agreed that there was something different about it. In his review of The Fellowship of the Ring, L. Sprague de Camp called it the most singular novel of its class. Though it wasn't until a decade later that it really broke into the mainstream, fueled in large part by its popularity among the counterculture of the 60s and 70s, leading it to become one of the best-selling books in all of human history. And a lot of you will probably expect me to go into some downer ending about how this was the end of all originality in fantasy, that all the previous authors we've talked about to this point were totally forgotten, and the genre became nothing more than a bunch of formulaic Tolkien clones. Except, that narrative isn't really the case. The history of post-Tolkien fantasy is a lot more complex than people give it credit for. Different tropes and styles and subgenres have risen up and gone out of fashion in rather distinct eras. To fully go over all of them would take several more 4-hour videos, and maybe someday I'll get around to making those, but most of the major books from this time are still on my TBR list, and it'll take me quite a while to get through them all. But for now, I can at least do my best to give a brief sketch for how we got to where we are today. You see, the success of The Lord of the Rings doesn't mean that all other types of fantasy just suddenly went away. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, there was a continuation of the very same pulp fantasy tradition that we've been going over in this video, published as short stories in magazines or as mass-market paperback novels, closely intertwined with the much larger science fiction fandom at the time. Pretty much all of these authors had read The Lord of the Rings, and most of them greatly admired Tolkien. But they weren't in any rush to copy him. They were content to leave The Lord of the Rings as sui generis. Or, at the very least, none of them were bold enough to rip off Tolkien while he was still alive. Not to mention that the pulp market incentivized short and hastily written stories, which makes it very hard to emulate something on the scale of The Lord of the Rings. Instead, authors from this era tended to evoke other writers like Edgar Rice Burroughs or Robert E. Howard, along with mixing in plenty of new ideas. Some standouts from this era include Michael Moorcock's sword and sorcery hero Elric, the exiled albino Emperor of Melniboné, whose tale is full of angst and melodrama, leading up to his inevitable demise at the hands of the very source of his power, the demonic runesword Stormbringer. There's also Ian McCaffrey's science fantasy series Dragon Riders of Pern, which takes us inside the political drama and interpersonal conflicts of the ruling class on a human settlement on the planet of Pern, who maintain their position via their telepathic bonds with a species of dragon created by genetic engineering. And then there's high fantasy like Lloyd Alexander's The Chronicles of Prydain, or Ursula K. Le Guin's Earthsea cycle, which are often compared to The Lord of the Rings in the way they create an invented world that evokes the gravitas of old myths and legends. But in terms of the specifics of the plot and setting, they don't follow the Tolkien-esque template closely at all. And if you dig past the more prominent works of the era, you'll find, well, mostly you'll find a bunch of very mediocre, formulaic stories. But if you look even harder, there's plenty of hidden gems, especially when it comes to experimental countercultural authors like Jane Gaskell, Tanith Lee, or Samuel R. Delany, to name a few, whose stories really do deserve more recognition today. But the thing is, as rich and deep and fascinating as this tradition of pulp fantasy might be, it was also extremely niche, its readership mostly existing as a small subcommunity within the science fiction fandom. With perhaps the possible exception of the Conan stories that were being popularized by L. Sprague de Camp and Lynn Carter, none of these books came even remotely close to matching the sales of The Lord of the Rings. Ballantine Books, which had the rights to print The Lord of the Rings in the United States, launched the Ballantine Adult Fantasy series to try to repeat this success. Its primary strategy was to take older fantasy writers like Lord Dunsany and E.R. Edison and bring them back into print. But while this series was invaluable in terms of making these authors' works widely available, it only met with limited commercial success, and in its attempts to publish original fantasy, it didn't find much more luck. But in the mid-70s, the Ballantine Adult Fantasy series was absorbed into the science fiction imprint Del Rey Books, headed by Judy Lynn Del Rey, who put her husband, Lester Del Rey, in charge of the fantasy side of the business. Now, Lester Del Rey was an old-timer in the genre. He had been a contributor to Astounding Science Fiction and Unknown Worlds back in the day, and had been a member of Fletcher Pratt's Wargaming Circle. But in this position, he had the mindset of a businessman. He was out to recreate the Lord of the Rings success, and looking over submissions, he found the perfect candidate, a first-time author named Terry Brooks, who had spent the last several years working on a fantasy epic titled The Sword of Shannara. This was a story that was, to put it lightly, heavily inspired by the Lord of the Rings. It's set in a magical world inhabited by a mix of humans, elves, and dwarves. It features a fellowship of heroes who go on a quest to defeat the evil Warlock Lord, and it's even been noticed that many of the specific characters and plot points have direct parallels to characters and events in The Lord of the Rings. This type of derivative, Tolkien-esque fantasy had never really been done before, but the Del Reys were willing to take the risk. They went all in, putting all of their effort into marketing the book to general audiences beyond the niche sci-fi circles where these types of stories were usually distributed. And this paid off massively. Although it got mixed reviews from critics, The Sword of Shannara was an instant bestseller when it was released in 1977, far surpassing anything in the genre since The Lord of the Rings. This sent a signal that the Tolkien phenomenon was something that could be replicated, and it was only a matter of time before more books in a similar style would follow, pushed by Del Rey and increasingly by other publishers who wanted to get in on the bandwagon. The 1980s and 1990s would see the rise of fantasy as a major, profitable genre, and it seemed to be headlined entirely by books that were all cut from the exact same cloth. Now, to be fair, each of these authors put their own individual flourish on things, and very few of them copied The Lord of the Rings as closely as The Sword of Shannara did, but there's also no question that all of these books tended to revolve around a narrow set of themes, of good versus evil, of an epic quest to save the world, of a super special chosen one hero who's the only one that can lead this quest. Something that, I might note, wasn't actually present in The Lord of the Rings, but nonetheless came to be a staple of Tolkien-esque fantasy. However, if we're talking about how our modern, stereotypical vision of fantasy came to be, then Lester Del Rey and Terry Brooks are only half of the story. The other half, concurrent with all of this, involves Gary Gygax. He released a medieval war game called Chainmail in 1971. And as a lark, he also stuck in a fantasy supplement so that players could pit armies of elves, orcs, and dragons against each other. This may have remained nothing more than a simple oddity, except that a game master named Dave Arneson, playing with the Chainmail Fantasy rules, found that his players didn't enjoy the traditional wargaming mechanics of leading armies into battle half as much as they did the side quests he developed, where they played the role of individual units recovering loot from dungeons. This group got Gygax's attention, and he collaborated with Arneson to create a rule set for a new type of game, given the straightforward name of Dungeons & Dragons, first released in 1974. D&D found unexpected success, and as more modules were released, Gygax took a kitchen sink approach, mixing together elements from across traditional folklore and fantasy literature. And in the 1979 A&D Dungeon Master Guide, he includes Appendix N, where he lists out all of the authors who helped inspire the development of the game. J.R.R. Tolkien is, of course, there. It's from him that we get the classic races of humans, elves, dwarves, and orcs. But he was only one of many authors on the list. Lord Dunsany also gets a mention, but the vast majority of them, the ones that Gygax most enjoyed and pulled the most elements from, were the pulp, sci-fi, and fantasy authors that we've been going over in this video. Perhaps most famously, the Law vs. Chaos alignment system was created by Poul Anderson, and then spun off into an entire cosmology in the multiverse of Michael Moorcock before it was then copied by D&D. And then, at the end of the appendix, Gygax gives a special shout-out to 7 authors who served as the most immediate influences upon AD&D. The earliest writer on that list is A. Merritt. His work probably wouldn't immediately make you think of D&D, but he was a particular favorite of Gygax's, and you can imagine how his subterranean, Lost World stories might have served as a source of inspiration when writing dungeon-delving modules. And then there's H.P. Lovecraft. If you ever flip through the pages of the first edition Monster Manual, you can definitely see his influence on many of the entries. Robert E. Howard is one that goes without saying. A D&D session is basically just a gamified sword and sorcery story. L. Sprague de Camp and Fletcher Pratt are listed together as a single item, which implies that Gygax was most inspired by their collaborations like the Harold Chase stories. These are, after all, zany adventures where our heroes randomly encounter a wide range of magical creatures and have to find creative solutions out of sticky situations. And then, another favorite of Gygax's was Fritz Leiber. D&D emulates his more fun, swashbuckling style of sword and sorcery, much more so than the gritty style of Robert E. Howard. If you ever read a Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser story, they definitely do have the same feel as a D&D adventure. And finally, there's Jack Vance. Specifically, the way magic spells work in The Dying Earth was directly lifted into the spell slot system in D&D, though many players found this system to be counterintuitive, so in time a supplement was created where casting spells uses up a limited supply of energy called mana, which is a term that technically originates in Polynesian religion, but as a fantasy concept was created in the 1976 pulp story The Magic Goes Away by Larry Niven. And of course, Gary Gygax did bring quite a few ideas of his own to the table. The most iconic of these is probably the Drow, or Dark Elves. This is a term that dates back to Norse mythology, but it was Gygax who came up with the specific interpretation of them as an evil race of gray-skinned subterranean elves. There's also the idea of the Lich, which comes from the generic Old English word for a dead body, but which Gygax imagines as an undead sorcerer who has achieved immortality through blood sacrifice. Though the basic concept does have some precedence in earlier fiction. In particular, D&D's conception of necromancy owes more than a little bit to Clark Ashton Smith. But even if all of these elements had appeared in earlier fiction, it's in D&D that they were all brought together in a single package. A very distinctive vision of fantasy that has gone on to really define the popular perception of the genre. Though D&D started in the 70s as a very niche hobby, its influence spread over time. In the 1980s, it cross-pollinated with the growing market of fantasy literature with tie-in novels like The Dragonlance Chronicles by Margaret Weis and Tracy Hickman, or The Legend of Drizzt by R.A. Salvatore. But its impact was most strongly felt in other mediums. In particular, fantasy video games from their very inception in early RPGs like Rogue and Wizardry have taken heavy influence from D&D in terms of their mechanics and settings, and this trend has followed into more recent series like The Elder Scrolls, Dragon Age, or of course the tie-in game series Baldur's Gate. And this style of fantasy would also gain traction abroad, perhaps most famously in Japan, thanks to the popularity of early video games like Wizardry that would go on to inspire homegrown imitators, and also to the breakout success of Record of Lodoss War, which began as a novelization of a D&D campaign and was adapted into a popular anime in 1990. And so, this type of fantasy grew into a staple of anime and manga, and evolved many of its own tropes and conventions which are subtly different from the norm in Western fantasy, but in recent years has managed to go full circle and gain popularity in the Anglosphere. And with all this, you might be expecting me to finally get around to that downer ending about how all originality in fantasy is dead, and because of Del Rey and D&D, everything is now stale and formulaic. But yet, once again, that narrative really isn't the case. If we go back to fantasy literature, there was a time when Tolkien-esque epic fantasy dominated the market, but this doesn't mean that it pushed out the more original work. During this period, there was still old-style science fantasy and sword and sorcery getting published. There was a rise of dark fantasy that aggressively rejected the optimistic good versus evil formula that seemed to dominate the mainstream. There were weird and experimental stories that tried to challenge any attempt to draw rigid genre boundaries. And the more that sales grew for those Shannara-style Tolkien-esque fantasy books, so too in response did demand grow for fantasy books that did something different. They became more and more successful until eventually they won. I don't think a lot of people who are more casual fans of the genre realize the extent to which the stereotypical type of fantasy that was all the rage in the 80s and 90s is now moribund. The last major series to follow in that mold was probably the Inheritance cycle, and it wrapped up over a decade ago. Taking a brief look at the type of fantasy that's been popular in more recent years, it's clear that the genre is becoming increasingly diverse. You have that kind of dark, low fantasy popularized by A Song of Ice and Fire, which in many ways can be seen as the fulfillment of that revolution that was first attempted by Fletcher Pratt. But you also have authors in the vein of Brandon Sanderson, who keep much of the optimistic, heroic spirit from the classic Tolkien-esque fantasy, while also incorporating many of the criticisms of that style. These books tend to have far more complex characterization and moral nuance than the older stories, along with making an effort to be more original in their world building. Here in particular, there's been a trend for increasingly complex horde magic systems, bringing the idea that we first saw in Unknown Worlds to full realization. And then there's also the trend of romantasy, which, whatever you may say about it, you can't accuse of being derivative of Tolkien. And all of this is just a small selection of the most popular works of the moment. People love to complain about the state of fantasy today, but the fact is, it's larger and more diverse now than it's ever been. If you're dissatisfied by the current bestsellers, you just need to dig a bit deeper towards independent presses or self-published works, or even stuff that people have put online for free. Whatever your ultra-specific taste may be, I guarantee that there is someone out there who is catering to it. Though, of course, this is just fantasy literature. If we look at other mediums like video games, anime, and manga, we'll find that that classic D&D style has been very persistent. It's not the only thing that's out there, but it's definitely a huge part of the market. The enduring popularity of this style of fantasy is often seen as a result of a lack of creativity, that these creators are incapable of original thought, so they just mindlessly repeat the same old tropes of elves and dwarves. I don't doubt that this is sometimes the case, but it feels insufficient as a full explanation. The franchises that make use of this standard fantasy setting often feature some of the most intricate and imaginative worlds in the entire genre. This D&D style of setting serves as something of a shared baseline, a generic format where people are free to put their own spin on things, and find ways to repurpose familiar tropes in new and creative ways. How much you enjoy this is a matter of personal taste, but there's no denying the great amount of creativity on display in this area. But now I've completely trailed off from the original topic of this video. You see, if I was to try to sum up my motivations for making all this, it's that fantasy is a genre where literally anything is possible, but yet it has a reputation for being extremely formulaic, for repeating the same tropes over and over again. However, the more I look into things, the more I realize that this isn't because creative and original works don't exist, but rather because most people just aren't aware of these works. They're only familiar with a small subsection of the genre and assume that this is all that's out there. So I hope this video will give you a wider perspective of the possibilities in fantasy, of the major styles and where they come from and how they developed over time. Or if you were already familiar with this beforehand, hopefully you're having a fun time typing out a comment explaining everything I got wrong. And here, my call to action is the same as the last video. Now that you have a better idea of what's out there, you should go out and read some of it yourself. It can be one of the pre-Tolkien books that we've gone over. It can be one of the pulp stories of the 60s and 70s. It can be one of those Tolkien-esque epics, or it could be some more recent bestseller. Wander around your local used bookstore and see what catches your fancy. My only request is that you go out of your comfort zone, and that you go out and find some type of fantasy that you wouldn't normally read. Or if you've read all the types of fantasy, then you can go out and familiarize yourself with another type of fiction. I hear the teens these days are all obsessed with something called Blood Meridian. And if you go out and read something new, you might find that you really enjoy it, that you can't believe you've been missing out on this for so long. And if you don't enjoy it, maybe you'll at least find something interesting about it, something that's worth further analysis. You might even decide to make your own 4-hour YouTube video about it. This is something that's apparently a lot easier than you might think. As at this recording, part 1 of the series is sitting at over 130,000 views, which is way more than I ever would have reasonably expected. As you can probably tell by the general production quality, I had very limited experience in audio-visual mediums leading up to this, and mainly decided to take it on because it seemed like a fun challenge. Thank you to everyone who's watched and commented. It's honestly been surreal to see how many people enjoyed watching it. And as for the future of this channel, I can't guarantee that I'll follow any kind of regular upload schedule. Over the next few months in particular, I don't anticipate having much spare time for YouTube, but the response to part 1 indicates there's quite a bit of demand, so I imagine that I'll be back eventually. But while you wait, I might as well recommend some other stuff you can look into if you enjoyed these videos. The main channel on YouTube specializing in these types of old fantasy books is probably Library Ladder. His most recent video goes over the literary career of Jack Vance, which is far more extensive than just the Dying Earth series. There's also the Appendix N podcast, where each episode discusses a book from the Appendix N that inspired D&D, and specifically goes over how they can be used as inspiration for role-playing games. And after spending so much time on pre-Tolkien fantasy, you might want to learn more about the man himself. There's a frankly absurd number of channels out there dedicated to Tolkien, but one I've enjoyed watching recently is Jess of the Shire. When making this video, I tried to make an effort to go beyond giving a surface-level summary, and instead try to analyze what makes each story tick, and to bring in outside sources to gain an understanding of the author and their intentions and worldview. But in discussing the works of Tolkien, she does a much better job than I could ever hope to. Her most recent video, as of this recording, Did Tolkien Hate Everything?, is a prime example. But the most fitting capper to this video would probably be the 6-hour biography on J.R.R. Tolkien uploaded by Cardinal West. And if you don't immediately feel up to that, I would also highly recommend his 2 videos going over the genre of xenofiction. That is, books about animal characters like Watership Down or Redwall. These videos were actually my main source of inspiration for how I laid out the format of this series. So if you've made it this far and you find that topic interesting, then you should definitely give them a watch. But that's all from me for now. Namarie.